Imagine living in a world where your entire life is dedicated to keeping a single fire burning. A fire so sacred, so vital, that the entire fate of an empire is said to rest on its flame. Now imagine this. If you falter, if you slip, if you're even accused of breaking a vow, the punishment is one of the most chilling in all of history. You're not whipped, not exiled, not even executed in the way criminals were. No, you are buried alive. This wasn't just a story whispered to scare children. This was the fate of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's holiest women, the guardians of the city's eternal flame. For centuries they lived with immense honor, but also immense danger. They sat at the very heart of Roman religion and politics, praised as sacred symbols of purity, yet constantly watched, constantly judged, and sometimes brutally destroyed. So, who were the Vestal Virgins? Why did Rome grant them so much power, and yet punish them with a death so terrifying it still shocks us today? Stay with me, because this is not just a story about ancient religion. It's about power, control, purity, and the razor-thin line between honor and horror in the world's most famous empire. To understand why the Vestal Virgins were so important and why their punishment was so extreme, we need to step back into the world of ancient Rome. Rome wasn't just a city. To the Romans, it was the beating heart of the universe. By the time the Vestals were at their peak, Rome had conquered huge parts of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Their armies marched across continents, their laws shaped entire civilizations, and their emperors claimed to rule with the blessing of the gods. And that last part, the gods, is key. For Romans, religion wasn't just about faith, it was about survival. Every battle, every harvest, every political decision, all of it had to be done with the gods' approval. If the gods were happy, Rome thrived. If the gods were angry, disaster followed. Floods, famine, defeat in war. So religion wasn't something private or personal. It was part of the state. It was politics. Now imagine living in a world where every little ritual had to be done perfectly. Miss one prayer, forget one offering, let one fire go out, and people believed the gods might punish the entire empire. That's how seriously they took it, and at the very center of this web of rituals was the goddess Vesta. She wasn't the goddess of war or wealth. She was the goddess of the hearth, the fire, the home. Her flame represented Rome itself, eternal, pure, unbroken. If that sacred flame ever died, Romans believed the city would fall. So who looked after this flame? Who made sure it never went out? Not soldiers, not emperors, not priests. It was the job of a small, secretive group of women, the Vestal Virgins. Rome was a society where men ruled almost everything. Women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and were usually expected to stay in the background. But the Vestals, they were different. They weren't just allowed into Rome's religious life. They were placed right at the top of it. Their job wasn't just about tending a fire. They were symbols of Rome's purity, guardians of its survival, and living proof that the gods were watching over the city. Which meant, if anything went wrong with them, it wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a cosmic disaster. That's why their punishment was so terrifying. It wasn't just about one woman breaking a vow. It was about protecting the empire from the anger of the gods. To the Romans, burying a Vestal alive wasn't cruelty. It was necessity, and that's the world they lived in. A city obsessed with power, terrified of angering the divine and willing to sacrifice its most sacred women to keep itself safe. So, who exactly were these mysterious women, the Vestal Virgins? They weren't just any Roman girls. Becoming a Vestal was one of the rarest and most life-changing paths a child could take in ancient Rome. The selection was strict. A girl had to be between 6 and 10 years old, from a respected family, and, most importantly, free of any physical or moral flaws, at least by Roman standards. In other words, she had to look healthy, come from a clean family background, and show signs of discipline. It was like being handpicked for a destiny far bigger than yourself. Imagine that moment. One day you're just a child in your family home playing in the courtyard. The next, a priest knocks on the door, and you're taken away to serve the goddess Vesta for the next 30 years. You didn't get to say no. Your parents couldn't refuse either. The state had chosen you, and that was final. For the first 10 years, new Vestals were students. They learned sacred rituals, chants, and how to care for the eternal flame. The next 10 years they served actively, performing ceremonies, making sacrifices and keeping the fire alive day and night. Then came the final 10 years, teaching the next generation of young girls who would replace them. At the end of 30 years, a Vestal was free. She could return to society, even marry if she wanted to, though many never did. After a life in the service of the goddess, the world outside often felt too strange and too distant. Now, why were they called virgins? Because their vow of chastity was absolute. For 3 decades, they had to remain untouched, pure, and completely devoted to Vesta. Their virginity wasn't just personal, it was political, it was spiritual. Romans believed the safety of the empire was tied directly to the purity of these women. It might sound like imprisonment, and in many ways it was. But here's the twist. Being a Vestal also came with incredible privileges. Unlike almost every other woman in Rome, a Vestal could own land, write a will, and manage her own money. She could free prisoners, sit in the best seats at the games, and even ride in a carriage, something normally reserved for senators and emperors. So the Vestals lived in a strange paradox. On one hand, they were worshipped, honored, and given freedom most Roman women could never dream of. On the other hand, they lived under crushing pressure, knowing that the smallest slip, or even a false accusation, could bring ruin. They were Rome's sacred daughters, placed higher than queens in status, yet trapped by a vow that could turn into a death sentence. At first glance, being a Vestal Virgin might sound like a prison sentence. Taken as a child, sworn to 30 years of chastity, constantly watched, constantly judged. But here's the surprising part. In some ways, Vestals were the most powerful women in Rome. While most Roman women were legally under the control of their fathers or husbands, a Vestal lived free. Once chosen, she was no longer tied to her family. She answered only to the goddess Vesta and to Rome itself. That independence alone set them apart. And with that independence came privileges that ordinary Roman women could only dream of. Take property, for example. Most Roman women couldn't own land in their own name, but a Vestal could. She could buy estates, manage wealth, even leave a will. That made her financially independent at a time when almost no other woman was. Then there was their legal power. If a condemned prisoner was on his way to execution, and he happened to meet a Vestal, she could pardon him on the spot. Imagine the sheer weight of that authority. A single word from a woman in white robes could spare a man's life, overriding even Rome's harshest laws. Vestals also had privileges in public. They were given the best seats at gladiatorial games and public festivals, right next to senators and magistrates. They rode in their own carriages through the city, something usually reserved for the elite. And when they appeared in ceremonies, the entire crowd treated them with reverence, as if they were walking between the human and divine worlds. Even Rome's most powerful men respected them. Political leaders often sought their blessings, knowing that the people believed Vestals carried divine favor. Their presence was thought to guarantee Rome's safety. In a city obsessed with omens and rituals, having a Vestal on your side was like having a living lucky charm. Their home, the house of the Vestals, stood right beside the Roman Forum, the beating heart of the empire. It wasn't just a place of ritual, but also a luxurious residence with gardens, fountains, and statues. Compared to the crowded homes most Romans lived in, the Vestals lived almost like royalty. Of course, all this honor came at a price. Every privilege they enjoyed, every seat of honor, every right denied to other women, it all rested on one fragile condition, that they never broke their vow. Their freedom wasn't really freedom at all. It was borrowed power, hanging by a thread. Still, for nearly 1,000 years, Vestals stood apart from the rest of Roman society. They were both admired and feared, symbols of purity, guardians of Rome's fate, and women with influence unmatched in the ancient world. But what happened when the very vow that gave them this power was broken? That's where the story takes a much darker turn. All the wealth, the honor, the power of the Vestal Virgins rested on one rule, one vow that could never, ever be broken: chastity. From the moment a girl put on the white robes of Vesta, she belonged to the goddess alone. For 30 years she was forbidden to marry, forbidden to love, forbidden even to hint at desire. She was expected to remain pure, untouched, and flawless, because Romans believed her purity wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. To them, the virginity of the Vestals symbolized the safety of Rome itself. Just as the sacred fire burned in the temple without end, so too were the Vestals expected to live unbroken, untarnished lives. If either failed, if the flame went out, or if a Vestal broke her vow, it meant danger for the empire, and Rome took this connection very seriously. When disasters struck, a lost battle, a famine, an earthquake, suspicion sometimes fell on the Vestals. Maybe the fire had gone out, maybe a virgin had sinned. Superstition turned these women into easy scapegoats. Even the smallest slip could carry consequences. If the sacred fire of Vesta ever went out, the entire city panicked. People feared the gods were sending a warning. And in those cases, the chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus, would punish the Vestal responsible, not with death, but with something humiliating and painful. She would be stripped and beaten, sometimes in the dark, so that technically no blood was spilled. Even then, the law bent over backward to protect the idea of her sacredness while still punishing her. But the real terror came if she was accused of breaking her vow of chastity. Unlike today, where a trial might weigh evidence carefully, in Rome, accusation was often enough. A rumor could destroy a Vestal's life. Powerful men could use these women as pawns, accusing them to cover up political failures or to prove their own devotion to the gods. And because a Vestal's purity was tied to the fate of the empire, the punishment had to be extraordinary. Rome believed it could never spill a Vestal's blood. Executing her like a criminal was unthinkable. Yet letting her go free was seen as inviting divine punishment. So the Romans invented something chilling. A way to erase a Vestal without technically shedding her blood. A punishment so unique, so haunting, that it became one of the darkest rituals in Roman history. The same women who were honored as almost divine, who could pardon prisoners and command respect from senators, now faced a fate worse than death if they faltered. Their vow was their crown, and their curse. So what happened when a Vestal Virgin broke her sacred vow, or was accused of it? First came the trial. But don't picture a fair courtroom with witnesses and defense lawyers. This was Rome. If the chief priests and senators decided the gods were offended, that was it. Guilt could come not from proof, but from whispers, rumors, even bad omens. And once the verdict was made, there was only one punishment: burial alive. The ritual was designed to be terrifying, not just for the condemned woman, but for all of Rome. It was a public performance of purity destroyed, a warning carved into the city's memory. The Vestal would be stripped of her sacred robes, her hair cut short, her veil taken away. The white garments that once made her untouchable were gone. She was no longer sacred. She was simply human, and doomed. Then, at night or in silence, she was led through the city. Not in chains, not dragged like a criminal. Rome had to pretend this was not an execution. She was still technically pure, still technically holy, and her blood could not be spilled. So instead, she walked veiled, escorted by guards, surrounded by a procession of priests. Crowds lined the streets, but few dared speak. People watched as one of their most sacred figures was slowly escorted to her grave. The place of execution was just outside the city gates, in a lonely field. There, an underground chamber had been prepared. Inside was a bed, a lamp, a little water, and a few scraps of food. To the Romans, this meant they weren't killing her. They were simply shutting her away, leaving her in the hands of the gods. But everyone knew the truth. The Vestal would be led down into the chamber. For the last time, she would see the light of day. Then the priest would climb out, and the entrance would be sealed. Earth would be shoveled over the chamber until no trace of it remained, and inside, she would wait. Maybe the lamp would flicker and die first, leaving her in total darkness. Maybe the bread and water would last a few days before hunger and thirst set in. Maybe fear alone was enough to crush her long before her body gave out. However it came, death would be slow, silent, and absolute. For the Romans above, the ritual was complete. They could breathe easier, believing the gods had been appeased. For the Vestal below, there was only darkness, and that's how Rome punished the women it called sacred, by turning honor into horror, and burying its daughters alive beneath the very city they were sworn to protect. The burial of a Vestal wasn't just a myth or a legend. It happened, and each case reveals just how dangerous life could be for these so-called sacred women. One of the most famous victims was Cornelia, a chief Vestal during the reign of Emperor Domitian in the 80s AD. Cornelia was widely respected, known for her strict devotion, but suddenly rumors spread that she had broken her vow. Domitian himself accused her, and when the emperor pointed his finger, who could argue? Cornelia protested her innocence right until the end. As she was led to her underground chamber, she cried out to the gods, declaring she was pure. But her words didn't matter. Rome had already decided she was guilty. She was buried alive, her voice silenced forever. Some stories, though, are even murkier. Take Postumia, a Vestal from the 4th century BC. She was accused not because of evidence, but because of how she behaved. The records say she laughed too freely, dressed too elegantly, and didn't act serious enough for a holy woman. In other words, she broke social expectations, not her vow. Luckily for her, she was acquitted. But her case shows how fragile a Vestal's reputation really was. Then there was Licinia, accused in 73 BC of having an affair with none other than Marcus Crassus, one of Rome's richest men. Crassus supposedly wanted her property, a beautiful garden he coveted. Whether they were guilty or not, the trial was a scandal. Licinia was acquitted, but only after enormous public pressure. It's a perfect example of how powerful men could weaponize accusations to get what they wanted. And it wasn't always just one woman. In the year 114 BC, 3 Vestals, Emilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused at the same time, breaking their vows with several high-ranking men. At first, 2 were declared innocent, but public outrage demanded harsher punishment. A second trial was held, this time with more political manipulation, and 2 of the Vestals were condemned and buried alive. Cases like these show how dangerous it was to stand as a symbol of Rome's purity. The Vestals were meant to be untouchable, but in reality they were perfect scapegoats. If Rome lost a battle, blame the Vestals. If famine struck, blame the Vestals. If an ambitious man needed an enemy destroyed, accuse a Vestal. To us today, their trials sound less like justice and more like theater, designed to show the people that Rome was taking the gods seriously, no matter how cruel the price. And for the women themselves, it meant living every day with the knowledge that the empire they served could, at any moment, turn against them. The Vestal Virgins are one of the strangest contradictions in Roman history. On the surface, they were celebrated as almost divine. They sat beside senators, commanded respect from generals, and carried privileges no other women could dream of. In a world where most women had no voice, the Vestals stood above it all. But look closer, and their power was an illusion. Every privilege they enjoyed was chained to their vow. They weren't free. They were trapped in the narrow role Rome demanded of them. Pure, silent, perfect. Their bodies weren't their own. Their lives weren't their own. They belonged to the goddess, to the city, to the idea of Rome itself. And when things went wrong, when famine struck, when enemies attacked, when politics turned ugly, the Vestals became the perfect scapegoats. Rome worshipped them as symbols of purity, then destroyed them at the first sign of failure. It's this paradox that makes their story so haunting. They were both prisoners and priestesses, honored and expendable, powerful yet powerless. In the end, the Vestals reveal the truth about Rome itself, a civilization that built glory on control, demanded perfection from its people, and was never afraid to sacrifice even its most sacred symbols to keep its empire alive. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins kept Rome's sacred flame alive. But no empire lasts forever, and neither did their order. By the 4th century AD, Rome was changing. Christianity was spreading fast, and with it came new ideas about gods, purity, and power. The old temples of Jupiter, Mars, and Vesta were no longer the heart of the empire. Instead, bishops and churches began taking their place. In 394 AD, Emperor Theodosius declared Christianity the official religion of Rome. Pagan rituals were outlawed, sacrifices banned, and temples shut down. The eternal flame of Vesta, which had burned for centuries as the very soul of Rome, was extinguished forever. And with it, the Vestal Virgins disappeared. For some, it was a shocking moment, as if Rome itself had lost its divine protection. For others, it was liberation, the final end of a system that demanded women give up their lives in service to the state. But the memory of the Vestals never truly died. Even centuries later, historians and poets would look back at them as symbols of Rome's glory, mystery, and cruelty. They embodied the best and worst of the empire, honor and oppression, reverence and fear. Their flame may have gone out, but their story still burns, a reminder that even the most powerful traditions can vanish, and that the line between worship and sacrifice is thinner than we'd like to believe. So next time you hear the name Rome, don't just think of marble temples and marching legions. Remember the women beneath it all, women who carried a city's fate in their hands and who sometimes paid for it with their lives. If you found this story as chilling and fascinating as I did, make sure to hit the like button so more people discover it. Subscribe to the channel for more forgotten stories of history's dark side, where truth is often stranger and more terrifying than legend. And don't forget to comment below. Would you have chosen the honor of being a Vestal Virgin, knowing the risk that came with it?